Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks ever so much for joining again. I hope you can hear me and see me. It's been a slight panic preparation this evening, so hopefully we're all good. I think we've got everything in place. But I can see that you're all here, so thank you very much. We've got plenty to talk about because although it may not have been the most exciting race we've ever had in the 2021 season, not especially compared to those exhilarating first two, I personally still quite liked a number of elements of it. I think the strategy was still interesting enough to keep me going. I think the battle at the front between not just Lewis and Max, but Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas, all kind of in the mix this week. So I thought that was all interesting. For me, there was plenty to keep me on the edge of my seat, enough to say I'm not throwing the towel in yet. I'm still well up for this 2021 season. So I hope the same goes for you too. So we'll get into plenty of your questions, of which there are loads. Let me see, slow mode is on, charging your camera. Yeah, I am charging my camera. Can you, you can see me. There is a slight possibility that my camera will die at some point this evening because the battery is so low. I'm not sure that the charge cable is going to override the amount of use it's getting, but I've got a backup plan, so we're going to be good. We're going to be good. Hello to you all. Let's get some hellos in. Hello from Sully, California. Lotus T98, hello to you. Portugal's a copy and paste of Spain. Well, okay. Hello to you, wherever you are. Hi from Birmingham, Dominic Stevens. Hi from Scotland as well. Thank you very much to all of you. G Thompson, hello from Bonnie, Scotland. Hello from the San Francisco Bay Area. Thank you very much. Yorkshire in the house with Charlie. Thank you. Thank you to everybody for joining. Welcome back again. Right, where should we start? Let's start with the battle between, let's go between Mercedes and Red Bull first of all. I want to know your thoughts on all of this. Less about Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, more about the two teams. Because I sort of feel like what we saw this weekend was a Mercedes that is much more comfortable on the harder range of tyre. I put it in the intro for those that read it. A harder range of compounds that we saw this week from Pirelli, which we'll get into that discussion as well. Too hard, really, if we think about it, for to liven up the race through tyre strategy in that way. So it definitely was too hard from that. Pirelli, of course, have to go that way because they think the risk of running softer tyres could potentially start to edge towards the unsafe zone through some of those long, particularly the last corner, long, very fast right-hander. They think there's a safety issue in that. I mean, it's difficult to argue with that. But from a strategy perspective, the tyres were too hard. You could pretty much go flat out all the way on this one-stop strategy that everybody did, more or less. And it didn't give the most exciting race. Combined with that, we didn't get the things that we had in the first two rounds, which were safety cars, weather, that always spice these things up too. So, but look, Mercedes versus Red Bull, it seems close, doesn't it? Close enough to keep the battle interesting, and I think it will continue long into this season. But I felt like Mercedes had this advantage on the harder end of the compound range, which, by the way, we have those same harder compound ranges coming to Spain for this weekend's Spanish Grand Prix too. Although it's a different circuit, although it'll be slightly different temperatures, the track surface is definitely very different. There are some similarities between the two tracks. As somebody said, it's not quite a copy and paste, but there are some similarities. Same compounds. I don't think we'll necessarily get exactly the same result, but I do think we are seeing a Mercedes that's happier with the warm-up of its tyre on the harder end of the range. A Red Bull, perhaps with more downforce. We saw that, didn't we, on the straights, that Red Bull was losing out massively on the straights because their setup favoured a higher downforce approach. That high rake, of course, gives them that opportunity for a higher peak downforce. But I think the setup specific to that track, they favoured a higher downforce approach, which, okay, gave them some real performance through the corners. In terms of overall lap time, wasn't a huge amount difference. But in the bits that mattered, i.e. along the straights, the bit where you can overtake, they didn't have the pace to match a Mercedes that had gone for a lower downforce, higher top speed type setup, and I think that was perhaps one of the biggest differences. But they were able to do that because Red Bull are able to use that higher downforce to really warm up those soft and sticky tyres that are at the softer end of the range. But of course this weekend, where we had that much harder compound set, they're much harder to warm up. They take longer. They just take more laps to get that heat generated into them, and Mercedes seems more capable on those tyres. So I still think it's going to be close though. So I want to see what you guys say. Pirelli should be less conservative, says Carola Rue. Yeah, I mean, look, from a fan's perspective, of course, and from a driver's perspective, we always want to see the softer tyres because they're soft and sticky, they're more grippy. The drivers love them because they give more grip. They're faster ultimately, and they force the drivers potentially into more pit stops. But Pirelli have to take into account safety, and we can't really argue too much with that. Bottas can run in the simulator 24 hours a day. Hamilton drives in real life. Not quite sure what that means, but there we go. I think a compact track like this one tends to suit the Mercs better. Yeah, this circuit definitely favoured Mercedes, and I think that tyre thing that I was just talking about probably combined with that as well. But this is a circuit that Lewis Hamilton loves. I think Max Verstappen loves it too, but their car favours the twisty bits for getting the best out of it. So there's certain corner segments where the Red Bull was clearly faster. On the straights, not so much. And in a race situation, we saw how Max was hampered by that, in that I think if Valtteri hadn't had the issues with his car, even he would have probably found his way past Max Verstappen at some point in that race. So circuit specific, tyre specific, overall that one just swung in the favour of Mercedes, but not by a huge amount, not by much, right? The Portuguese Grand Prix was boring. Look, it was boring compared to the first two, but I think we're going to get races like that, aren't we? Unless, look, and this is an age-old argument, unless you put every driver in the same car with the same engine, same power unit, and let them all race like in Formula 2, you're always going to get races where one team or one driver dominates. One team gets the best out of it. And that's the way it is. Without weather or safety cars or crashes or incidents like that, that's the way Formula 1 is. The fastest cars start the race at the front. In all normal conditions, if there is a periodic spread throughout the field of performance, the fastest cars who start the race at the front of the grid will gradually just pull away unless something happens. That's Formula 1. We need that thing to happen on a more regular basis. And weather is playing its part, given we've got shuffled up calendar. But sometimes we're going to get a race that just doesn't do that. And I think this weekend we still had enough things for me, as I said, to keep it interesting enough. But yeah, it wasn't as good as the other two, was it? What do you think of Bottas's performance? So Valtteri Bottas didn't show enough for me. There were a number of circumstances that went against Valtteri this weekend. In terms of he had an exhaust temp sensor failure in the race. I'll talk about that in a moment. He had a slow pit stop. Those things definitely didn't go his way, of course, but he didn't show enough. He started that race on pole position. He had a car, in the most part, given bar that sensor failure, he had a car in the most part capable of coming better than third place. And I think that's a shame. He doesn't seem to show enough aggression for me. You've got to just say, if it was the other way round, if Lewis had started that race on pole, we probably wouldn't have seen him. He'd have disappeared off into the distance, I would imagine. Maybe even the same for Max, given that, if they had that same car performance. But Valtteri doesn't seem to have that killer instinct. And I don't know whether it's just that he's too nice a guy. I've seen a number of racing drivers come through Formula 1 who are so nice, brilliant people to be around, brilliant people to work with. Maybe they don't have that killer instinct that the big greats, the big guns of our sport have had. The Schumachers, the Hamiltons, the Sennas, and a number of others have all had that killer instinct, and I don't see it in Valtteri, I'm afraid. So it's a shame, because he's got a great opportunity and he's certainly got great pace. Just don't think he's got quite the race killer instinct that he needs. What do you think Perez will be able to fight at the front eventually? I do. I really do. I think there are a number of things with Perez that are showing more and more signs of confidence. And also, the other thing that I think is a big difference between Perez and some of the other drivers that have gone through that seat before him is that, he finished fourth on Sunday, and I don't think he was happy with it. I think if it had been Albon, I think it had been Gasly in their shots in that car, they were quite happy with fourth. Getting their way up to fourth was seemingly a decent result. Well, I don't think Sergio's happy with that, because he's going to measure himself not just against, that Red Bull car being the fourth, in the top, it should take up the top four positions, 2 Red Bulls and 2 Mercedes, but he's going to measure himself against Max. he will believe he's as good as Max. All right, that's up for debate, and he's definitely not got the experience in that car that Max has. It's going to take him time, but I think he sees himself as better than the performances that he's given so far, and that's fair enough. He is better than those performances. He's just got to get his head round the nuances of that Red Bull car, I think. But in answer to your question, I do see him fighting his way towards the front on a more regular basis. And as I said before, it could well come down to the difference between Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez over this season as to who could end up winning the Constructors' Championship. Checo blamed Lando for ruining his race. Right, I want to get into this because, first of all, I don't think Checo blamed him for ruining his race, but Lando, who I'm a huge fan of, did overtake him with all four wheels off the circuit. I don't think there's too much debate about that. You could see it quite clearly when you look at the onboards, when you see the replays, and yet for some reason he wasn't penalised. And yet, when you look at the race director's notes, the final edition of those notes, it clearly says if a driver gets a lasting advantage with all four wheels over the red and white curb, he will be penalised. And yet he wasn't. So yeah, I'm not sure. It seemed like a strange one. And track limits for me is one of these things that is too much of a talking point. I know we've always said that in the past, but am I wrong in going, why can't we just use the same thing? I mean, yes, it should be the white line. Even in the sporting regulations, the edge of the racetrack is defined by the white line. There's a clause in there somewhere that says something like a driver must at all times keep a part of his car on the racetrack, i.e. to the inside of the white line. And yet, over the course of every race weekend, we change that. We say, okay, well, today we're going to make the racetrack the edge of the red and white curb. Or at this particular corner, you can actually run wide, we're not going to police it. And then at some point over the race weekend, maybe they'll change that again and they'll go, well, actually from now on, we're going to police this corner and this is going to be the limit. It seems to make no sense. Certainly from a spectator perspective, we can't get our heads around it. From a driver perspective, they just want consistency. I don't buy that, it's ruined Checo's race necessarily. It definitely hampered it, but he did find his way back past again. It definitely wasn't the reason that Max Verstappen lost his fastest lap, because the race director's notes from Thursday clearly said that turn 14 was going to be policed for track limits. Unlike what you saw Max say in his post-race interview, that's a fairly basic oversight, and the driver has a responsibility together with the team manager to make sure that everyone's well aware of all the rules. And clearly Max wasn't on that situation. So that goes squarely at the blame lies at his door for that one. But this inconsistency with track limits is something that I know winds everybody up, and I fully agree with all those who have that opinion. Josh Smith says, I've been watching F1 for 15 years and I'm confused by track limits at the moment. Exactly. Exactly. Kane Johnsy says, the car catches the curb and holds on. If you're talking about Lando, it was borderline. I mean, look, it looked to me, when I looked at the replay, it looked like he'd gone over the track limits. I mean, look, I'll hold my hands up. If he didn't, he didn't. But the point is, these things are not necessarily being policed in a consistent manner, not just over the course of this race weekend, but from one race weekend to another, from one day to another, sometimes over the course of a race weekend. And that, I think, is the thing that has to be ironed out. Consistency, no matter whether we agree or not on where the edge of the track should be, as long as it's consistent and the same all the time, I think we'll be happy with that. There we go. Right, let's talk about the midfield. The real battle is the midfield. That's exciting, says Eduardo Castro. Well, it is. I don't think that's the real battle. I think there are a number of great battles up and down this field this year, which is what makes the season quite a compelling one. We've definitely got a real battle at the front. And for those people who are saying, this is going to be a walk in the park for Lewis, I disagree. I do think that, Lewis has had an advantage at a couple of races. Maybe he still has an advantage with his car, but this is the closest that Red Bull have been in many years to Mercedes. Max is on form as well. I think this is going to be a proper ding-dong between those two. And I do think that some circuits will favour Max and Red Bull, and some will favour Lewis and Mercedes. And it may well be that one of those, and it may well be that it's Lewis again, ends up with a slight advantage. And if that's the case, he's just got to keep doing his consistent great performances and he'll win the championship. But Formula One doesn't always work like that. There will be moments when the weather plays a part, when a bit of luck will go for or against one of those two, where they might even come together in certain races, where reliability could well play its part, where the other drivers from those teams will play a role. Back markers could get in the way. I mean, there could be all manner of things, strategy, whatever. So the fact it's so close, for me, tells you it's a real battle and we must not take our eyes off it. But, as you rightly say, further down the field, we've got some great stuff happening, haven't we? We've got McLaren seeming to be in a great position, at least with Lando. Daniel's struggling at the moment, but Ferrari, on certain occasions, coming on song as well. Even Alpine this weekend, looking far more racy than they have done. So this is a great midfield battle that, again, I don't think we can call it at this point, because I think it's going to ebb and flow. Got a couple of new drivers in that mix who are still finding their feet. Daniel Ricciardo is not a driver of the performance level we saw this weekend. He will get to grips with that car. And when he does, if he can match Lando Norris, well, McLaren look to be in a great position, don't they? So the midfield battle is absolutely brilliant. Ocon and Alpine did well. Perhaps the track suited them better. I do think the track suited them better. I also think they brought a new floor to that car. They brought some updates last time out in Imola. This weekend they brought a new floor. And the floor is a real key area this year, more so than it has been, because we've got this regulation change just ahead of the rear tyres. And it's not just that that's made a huge difference, but what it has done is forced teams to look in different areas to regain their performance. And I think, Alpine perhaps a little bit behind the curve in finding the right solution for their floor edge. The edge of the floor that now tapers away, that many teams are now starting to tweak and play around with. It's going to be a constant battleground, that, because it's new. And if you remember, if you saw my pre-season video analysis on the cars, the Alpine has a very different configuration in terms of that big, high bulbous airbox behind the driver's head. And to go with that, much narrower side pods, giving them much more horizontal floor space along the side of those side pods to play with for manipulating airflow. So they have a slightly different opportunity around that space to manipulate flow down towards the rear of the car. And perhaps only now are they figuring out ways to do that. But it felt like they brought more performance to the car, and both drivers in a much happier position this weekend. So if that continues, again, it adds to that midfield battle, doesn't it? Mick Schumacher made a good overtake on Latifi. He did. What happened with that was Mick Schumacher, who's definitely finding more and more confidence in that, what is a very difficult car to drive. He overtook Latifi because he put constant pressure on him. The overtake in the end was actually just a fairly simple overtake because Latifi ran wide, didn't he? Overcooked a corner. So the overtake wasn't a blistering, groundbreaking overtake, but it came because of constant pressure from Mick Schumacher. And look, when you're in a car of that calibre that's so hard to drive, so far off the pace, any overtake is a brilliant overtake. Those are the battles that you live for when you're at that end of the field. And, when you're in that team, when you're in that garage, you've got no hope of winning a race. You've got no hope of winning a world championship at the moment. So your battles are with the people around you. And when your driver makes an overtake on another driver that's in your calibre, it means the world. It's like winning a Grand Prix. So the moment that would have given his team would have been brilliant. And also for Mick, of course, a massive boost of confidence. So yeah, he's seeming like on good form, light years ahead of Mazepin. He looked out of his depth more so this weekend. He looked very, very, first of all, slow and off the pace, but not even in complete control of his car on a number of occasions. Got his first penalty point as well, Mazepin, for getting in the way of Sergio Perez. Right. All right, hi Marc, Lunga here from South Africa. Who's your money on between Lewis and Max if the machinery is somewhat evenly matched throughout the season? Well, somewhat evenly matched is what it will be, but it won't be evenly matched. And as I said before, there'll be occasions when it suits one or the other. My early feeling is that Lewis and Mercedes might still have a small advantage, but it's very early in the season to say that. And of course, there's still some scope for development. Both teams, all teams, some have already done it, but those two teams are probably going to be the last two teams to switch off development on the 2020 car. And what I mean by that is, if you don't know, is that much more of the development is already being focused on the 2022 car. Sorry, 2021 car, not 2020 car. Well, I guess it is the 2020 car to some extent. It's been carried over. Anyway, I'm waffling. Much of the team's development now is already on the 2022 car because there's a massive regulation change coming, which means they've left a small portion of their drawing office, their design team, working on the 2021 car, looking for areas of improvement, looking for updates that can be brought in this early part of the season. But at some point, they will switch all focus onto 2022 and just stick with whatever technology they have and work on fine-tuning it over the course of a race weekend and with setups in the simulator. And that's going to be a really key differentiator, because those two teams, if they are really in a close battle for the championship and it goes on into the middle of the season, no one's going to want to pull the trigger first. No one's going to want to give up on this car. But if you do that, you compromise what you can put onto next year's car. When you've got such a massive change coming, that could hurt you further down the line. But do you say, well, who knows what will happen next year? We've got an opportunity this year. Let's just keep fighting for as long as it takes. Or do you say the opportunity next year is so big, we can't afford to miss it? It's going to be really interesting. I don't know which way that's going to go. So in answer to your question, I've gone a long-winded way about it. I'm going to sit on the fence. If I really had to put money on it, I think I'd say Lewis. Partly because of his experience, which counts for a lot, his dependability behind the wheel. I mean, I say that even after he made a mistake in Imola, but the reason that stood out is because it's so rare to see Lewis Hamilton make a mistake like that, and I don't think he'll make very many of them. I don't think he'll make another one like that this season. So his reliability from a driving perspective and his experience, even if they were perfectly level in terms of car performance, you've got to say that's one advantage that Max Verstappen simply can't match. They're both brilliant, talented drivers at the very top of their game, but one thing that Max hasn't got yet that Lewis absolutely has is years of experience. And not only that, but years of experience in winning championships. So if I had to put my money on it, it would be with Lewis. Do you think Bottas will be happy with his 1 point that he gained? If you mean by the fastest lap, I do want to talk about this because I saw a question somewhere else, it might have been on Twitter, who, by the way, if you're sending me a question for this show, whether it's on Instagram, on Twitter, on YouTube itself, wherever, use hashtag AskElvis, because what I've got right now is a screen in front of me that is just showing all the hashtag AskElvis comments on my feed. So if you put any question for tonight's show, just make sure you put hashtag AskElvis and it will pop up in here. I saw a few dotted around earlier that just didn't have the hashtag, and I haven't got time to go around collecting them all up from everywhere. I just use that hashtag to find them. So that's a little bit of housekeeping. But what was the question going? It was about the fastest lap point. Was Valtteri Bottas happy with the extra point? He'll have been more happy than if he hadn't got it, absolutely. But does fastest lap, and I think the question that came into me was, does the fastest lap, given that it's been a talking point for the past two races, has my opinion changed on whether it's a good thing? No, it hasn't. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this, right? When I looked at the race yesterday and realised that Valtteri came in for that stop, which, by the way, was a horrendous cock-up from Mercedes, coming in 2 laps before the end, just opened the door, gave Max a lap to respond to that, and a free gap behind him to do it. It was a massive cock-up. All that Valtteri's team had to do was leave it till the last lap, then pull him in for the stop. Then he would have had 1 free lap on fresh tyres to go and do the business, and Max couldn't have responded. If Max hadn't put a foot over the line and had that track limits violation, of course, he would have absolutely taken the point away, which was exactly the opposite of the situation Mercedes were trying to create. Now, do I agree with fastest lap? No, I think I was going to say pointless. It's not pointless. Get a point for it, but I don't think it's an addition to Formula One that we needed. Yes, on Sunday, there was a very dull race. It was looking like it was going to be processional to the flag. And what we got was 2 drivers pulling into the pits for a fresh set of tyres to go for what essentially boils down to like a qualifying lap. My argument against this is that that's not racing. And what the record books will show is that Lewis Hamilton won that Grand Prix by 30 or 40 seconds or whatever it ended up being. He didn't win it by that much because he only won it by that much because everyone else gave up on the race and just went for a qualifying lap. That's not Grand Prix racing. For me, that has no place in Formula One. I don't even think it was a spectacle. We didn't even get to see both of those laps being done flat out all the way through, all the way around on TV. So, you know, it adds something to it, but for me, it's not something that's worthy of Grand Prix racing. If you really desperately want to hand out a point, an extra point for something, either give it for pole position or a fastest pit stop or whatever. But you know what? We don't need an extra point, personally. Pole position, if anything, could deserve a point, but not the fastest lap. It spiced up the race though, did it? Did it spice up? I mean, look, if you disagree with me, then tell me. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't see how it spiced up the race at all. In fact, it did nothing for the race. It, you know, like I say, you saw two guys going on a qualifying lap, but we saw all that on Saturday. We know how fast these guys can go over one lap on a fresh set of tyres. Do we need to see it again on a Sunday at the end of a race when there's nothing much more than a point on it? Will Lando be on other teams? I'll come back to Lando in a minute. Ali H says fastest lap ruined the race in the end. I mean, I don't think it did anything. That's my point. I don't think it, you know, it kind of does ruin the race because it takes any element of racing out of the last few laps. But maybe there wasn't much of an element of racing anyway because everyone was in their set positions. I have no strong feeling for it or against it. I just don't see why we need it. Point for fastest pit stop is more interesting. I know from experience, if I'd been in the pit stop crew and there was a point available for fastest pit stop, that would have really given me a proper buzz. Because the best feeling is when the car comes in for a pit stop and maybe your main rival's doing the same thing a bit further down the pit lane and you come in together, and if you emerge first, the feeling that gives you is, I mean, I can't even describe it. It's incredible because me as just a normal mechanic, I'm just a guy out the back of the garage, I've contributed directly to a better position in the race. So if you're giving a point out for that, I would have been absolutely buzzing for that. But, you know, I just don't think we need it necessarily. I was going to say something else about fastest lap there. Oh, yeah, pit stops as well. Imagine Red Bull have consistently been fastest in pit stops. And what would it do? And if there was a point and offer for that, how would it change that whole dynamic? Would the likes of Mercedes and McLaren, who at the moment seem to be slightly struggling with that whole pit stop scenario, in fact, no one can really touch Red Bull on a consistent basis. Would the battleground in that side of things really heat up if there was a point and offer? Anyway, that's a whole other story. If the cars were closer, they wouldn't have the free pit stops to go for fastest lap. Absolutely, I mean, that's true. But, you know, look, I've said my bit. I sort of get the thinking behind it. The idea was that it might add some excitement to the end of the race, but I just don't see that it's done that personally. Right, I saw a good one there. Oh yeah, Cosmos Trek says, why did Ferrari go to medium tyres on Carlos instead of hard tyres? I bet that's the question they are asking themselves this morning. What a disaster. And this is where Ferrari, I think, let themselves down on quite a consistent basis, you know, through making decisions in the heat of the moment. They were the first ones to go onto the medium tyre. So you can say that everyone else maybe had some benefit from seeing what Carlos did, but you don't get the downside of that until much later on in the race. You don't understand how bad a decision that was. You can't watch Ferrari putting medium tyres on and look at that performance and say that's a negative, because the negative is when they wear out much later in the race. So you don't see that in the early phase. You just see the lap times. What Ferrari did, and seemingly did, was they had some calculations that said the medium tyre should go longer, or it should be durable enough to get to the end of the race whilst still being able to push. Maybe some calculations from Friday had told them that information, but clearly things had changed. Clearly things had changed, and everybody else figured it out. Everyone else realised that wasn't the right tyre to be on. Everyone at the front went hard tyres, and it was obviously the right decision in the end. And I hate criticising strategy in hindsight because it's so much easier with hindsight. But when Ferrari do this on an almost consistent basis, make poor decisions under pressure, you've got to start looking at why are they doing that? Is it something about the culture within Ferrari that stops people making the right decisions, that stops people going out on a limb to do something different to what the plan was, going off piste? if they believe that the situation's changed, there's now a better decision to be made. And it feels like that's what Ferrari are very poor at doing on a regular basis. Let me see. Can a team run 2 rake heights on the 2 different cars, says Tunga Troll. There's nothing in the rules to stop them doing that. But what you would end up with is and to be clear, and I'm sure most of you know this, but the rake on a car is not simply a case of jacking one up and jacking one down and seeing what happens. It's an entire design philosophy. And what I mean by that is those cars that you see with a high rake are specifically designed that way for the front wing to be working in a much closer proximity to the ground, with the whole underside of the car almost as an extension of the diffuser, expanding that airflow from underneath that really narrow gap at the front of the floor. As it speeds up, it drops in pressure, pulls the car down to the surface. But of course, and you can create higher downforce, higher peak downforce with that, but it's much more difficult to control. And so the whole car design is designed around which one of those 2 you go for. And so it's not just a case, if you tipped one up and kept one with a flat philosophy, it would be 2 very different car designs, and no one really has the scope to do that, particularly in this year, but no one's really got the scope to go down 2 completely different avenues with design. And on top of that, you'd only be getting data back from one car on the performance of that philosophy, as opposed to 2 cars when you're running the same thing. 2 cars worth of data is a hugely valuable source of information for development. If you only had one, it would take you much longer to get to a point of optimum performance with it. Ferrari only makes mistakes for their number 2 driver. No, they don't. They make mistakes all the time, I'm afraid. Ferrari, if you look back over the past, 10 years probably, even when I was, from the Michael Schumacher era, after that, they have made mistakes. I would say in Fernando Alonso's time there, they kind of had something quite good going on, but they still made mistakes. And a lot of it was strategy mistakes. It was team decisions. And if you listen to Ferrari's team radio, which I quite often do, it doesn't instill you with confidence. I sometimes listen to Charles Leclerc talking to his engineer, and his engineer is so subservient to Charles. And Charles' a young kid. All right, he's a great talent. He's brilliant, and he should lead the team in some respect. But it's almost like his engineer has zero confidence, and that, I think, is perhaps a microcosm for the whole team. But look, I'm only speculating, but that's my take on it. Lewis doesn't need Ferrari. Ferrari's strategy has always been dodgy. Well, over the years, it's not been great on many occasions. What do you think of Patio Ward? He won yesterday and will get a test with McLaren. Yeah, I don't know enough about him. So Pato Ward was in the IndyCar, wasn't he? And he's going to get a McLaren test as a result of that, which is great. He was signed up by Red Bull a few years ago, so he's a talent. And I'd love to see what he can do in a Formula One car, but I don't know enough about him really to give a proper appraisal. Is Russell good in qualifying or bad in the race? He's definitely good in qualifying, isn't he? I think we can safely say that he has outperformed that car consistently. He does a great job over a single lap, and I actually don't think he's bad in the race. He's made mistakes. He's a youngster. He's still learning his trade, but he's also got a very difficult car to contend with. They keep talking about Peaky Downforce, and what they mean by that is, in a little bit like the way Red Bull's been in previous years, but at the other end of the scale, Peaky Downforce suggests that sometimes it has great downforce, but it comes in peaks. If you looked at the downforce trace on a graph, it would be peaky like that. So other conditions, so things like the yaw angle of the car, things like the going up or down hills, wind direction, ride heights, and all these kind of things massively affect whether the car has good downforce or bad downforce. As the car pitches under braking or rolls through corners, those tiny little details have a massive impact on that car's overall downforce level, and that's an incredibly difficult thing to drive. Any Formula One car, that one of the most important things is having a consistent downforce level. Whether it's massively high or massively low, if it's consistent, a driver can handle it and learn to get the best out of it. If it's all over the place, it's impossible to predict what you're going to get when you barrel into any particular corner, and that's really hard. Peaky Blinders, Peaky Downforce. How's your seed stream prediction going? Well, better weekend this weekend, so congratulations. In fact, you might be watching, so I'm going to give a quick shout out to the guy who's currently leading our seed stream predictions. Black Bean is what you've called yourself on the seed stream app. 10 points, but from only 2 race weekends. He's only been in it for 2 events, not the full 3 like most of the rest of us, and he's got 10 points. In fact, a few people with just 2 predictions joined the series late, up there in the top 10. So for me, I am on, what am I on? I am all the way down in... I'll keep scrolling. I am down here in joint 36th position with 4 points from 3 rounds, so pretty dismal, but I did get 3 out of those 4 points this weekend, so it was a better weekend. If you haven't yet joined the Seed Stream Predictor League, the link for joining for Seed Stream, I think it might be in this description of this video. If it isn't, I'll put it in at the end. Go download the app. You'll find it at seedstream.org. That'll give you the Apple or the Android links. It's totally free. It's a brilliant app. I would say that because I'm part owner of it. But it is a brilliant app for all your Formula 1 news. But we've also now got this little predictor league going in there, which is really easy. You pick the top 5 for the race. Predictions open a week beforehand, so you can do it right now for this weekend's Spanish Grand Prix. And I'd love to see how you get on. Probably better than me. Josh Smith said my top 3 was correct. Yeah, mine too. That's where I got my 3 points. Absolutely. It's amazing how difficult it is just to predict the top 5. You think Formula 1's predictable these days? Try predicting the top 5. Not that easy. Right. Will F1 cancel the Turkish and Brazilian Grand Prix due to COVID-19? I have no idea. John Norris, I'm afraid I don't know on that one, and I'm in no place to guess either, I'm afraid. Thoughts on Seb Vettel's performance? It's not great, is it? It's not great. I think that, more so than just Seb, I think that car is a huge disappointment this year. And, I was thinking about this earlier. Sebastian Vettel is in danger of sort of following Fernando Alonso's kind of career path, having amazing success, even more so at Red Bull, got those 4 World Championships, made the decision to leave and move on to, you'd think, would be a great opportunity at Ferrari, and never quite got there. He's now made a switch over to what last year looked like a decent bet. Racing Point, as it was last year, had a car that on occasions was top 3. And yet this year they've plummeted down the order for various reasons, and Seb's got there at exactly the wrong time. But on top of that, as a driver, he is not the driver he used to be. And I honestly thought that this particular move to Aston Martin could well be the thing that he needed. If he was being stifled in a difficult environment at Ferrari, could this be the freedom that he needed to get out and get a fresh start with a team that's going to put an arm around him and give him every support that he needs in a car that looked good last year? And yet this year the car's taken a step backwards, and unfortunately Seb's struggles look to be very similar to the struggles that he had at Ferrari. So it's really difficult. Druva Sinanan says, hit like or Marc's mum will bollock us. I actually talked to my mum the other day. She said, are those people liking your video yet on a Monday night, or do I need to get back on there? Alonso has never outperformed like Vettel did in 2014 or 2020 though. Look, I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying that if you think about Sebastian Vettel at Ferrari, we now know there were certain reasons why the last couple of years at Ferrari they had a good car. We've seen some great results from Charles Leclerc, and we now know that in today's era that car would be illegal. Read into that whatever you want. But look, he had an opportunity with a great car at Ferrari, and for whatever reason it didn't work out for him, and now things just don't seem to be going his way. It feels like from the outside, it feels like he's a broken man. I mean, I have no idea on his personal state of mind, but that's the outside impression that we're starting to see. Talk about Kimi's rookie mistake. It was a rookie mistake, wasn't it? Unusual from Kimi, but I don't know if you've seen, but he's fair play to him. He came out and admitted it wholeheartedly. Said he was changing a switch on the steering wheel at the time, and when he looked down to change the switch and looked back up again, he'd connected with his teammate. What was very lucky about all of that was that Giovinazzi was able to continue unharmed, which the contact was big enough that on many occasions you'd have seen two cars out the race there. So yeah, it was a real unusual one from Kimi, a bit of a shame, and I'm sure he does not want to see the repeat of that, but lucky that his teammate was able to continue. Rob Graham, hey Elvis, sorry I'm late. No worries Rob, thanks for popping in anyway. Vettel's only good with the right car for him. And you know what? I hate to bash a driver like Sebastian Vettel. He deserves a lot of credit. 4 World Championships is no accident. But you've got to start to look at, was it that car? And does Sebastian need a car that has a very specific set of characteristics for him to be able to get the best out of it? I.e., can he not adapt as well as he needs to get the best out of a car that maybe doesn't have those characteristics? That might be something that he'll be looking at, and other people are certainly looking at. Has having children affected Vettel? Coming from a new dad, it's a big deal. It's a good point, G. Thompson. I don't know the answer, and only he will know the answer to that. But I'm a parent as well, and I think I've seen racing drivers have kids, and as it does with everything that you do in life, when you have kids, your perspective changes, your priorities change, and no racing driver can tell me their priorities don't change when they have kids. The good ones are still able to switch over to being full 100% racing driver mode when it matters, but I'm not saying he's not willing to give everything because he's worried about his kids or his safety or anything like that. It might be in the depths of his subconscious that maybe something's changed in his personal life that might be affecting his racing life. I don't know. But look, what goes on up here, up in our minds, sometimes definitely overrules what happens from a physical perspective. We know what we should do, we know how to do it, we know we want to do it. Sometimes our mind stops us from doing it, even in just the smallest ways. Shout out to McLaren. Yeah, we've done that already, but yeah, McLaren looking really racy at the moment, especially in the hands of Lando Norris. So on a real flyer, the car looks good. Lando seems to be full of confidence, and if they can get Daniel in that same level of confidence, they will be flying. Do you think the Strolls will soon pull out of F1 entirely? No, I don't at all. I think he's not bought the Aston Martin racing team as a little toy for his son. Of course, it's serving that purpose to some extent, but he's invested in that as an investment. And Lawrence Stroll is a shrewd investor. He's done it at a time when Formula One now has a spending cap, so his outgoings as a team owner are somewhat capped and limited now. It's not quite the money pit that it used to be. Still a huge money pit, but not quite the same level. And the potential for reward is now being much more evenly spread from the purse that Formula One brings. So it makes business sense. And of course, because he now owns Aston Martin or has invested heavily in Aston Martin, the brand, the two work perfectly together. So it makes perfect business sense. This is not about Lance Stroll. There will come a point when Lance Stroll will not be racing that car, but Lawrence Stroll will still be at the top of that team and seeing it as an investment that he hopes will bring a return, I think. AlphaTauri, issues in slow speed corners, Daniel hints. Yeah, they did. I must admit, I didn't seem to pay too much attention to AlphaTauri this weekend, but yeah, they were struggling, and it did seem like it was the slow speed stuff. In some ways, their car, because it's another one of these high rate cars, the slow speed corners are where those type of cars they can't produce the same level of downforce. And nobody can in slow speed corners, but it's all relative. The high rate cars tend to produce their max downforce at higher speeds, and that's where their biggest advantage comes. So perhaps, similar for Red Bull to some extent, that's where they were hampered a little bit. But I don't know enough about their struggles, I'm afraid. Stroll's not a terrible driver, says James Squire. I agree wholeheartedly. Stroll is not a terrible driver. I think he deserves his place in Formula One. Of course, he's only got that place because of his dad, but he's holding his own. And at the moment, he's showing a 4-time world champion a clean pair of heels on the most part. So There's nothing wrong with Lance Stroll being a worthy Formula One driver, in my opinion. He's shown great talent, he's shown great speed on occasion, he just doesn't do it consistently enough yet. Stroll's a long way off being four-time world champion. Well, of course he is, but you know, no one's saying he's a four-time world champion, but I think he's worthy of a place in Formula One. How come Mazepin learned to take corners suddenly, says Robin Visser. Did he? He may have learned to take corners, but just not very quickly. And I'm not saying this to jump on the bash Mazepin bandwagon. He's just a long way off the pace. A long way off the pace. Some of that will be down to his inexperience, but you know, he's got a driver in the other side of his own garage with a similar level of experience in Formula One, and in fact a lot less experience, if we're being honest. Mazepin, I don't know how many people know this, but Mazepin did a full round the world testing program with Mercedes, you know, as a paid personal testing. So he essentially, I actually went to an event with Heineken a couple of years ago at Barcelona, private event. We had one of the suites upstairs booked for this event where I was speaking. Downstairs were the Mercedes test team, and I know a lot of them. So I went down to say hello, and it was Nikita Mazepin doing a private and secret test, and they told me they've been all around the world doing this private days, a little bit like Stroll I think did a few years ago with Williams. So he's had a lot more experience than Mick Schumacher has in Formula One, and yet nowhere near the same level of pace. Is it normal for fresh F1 drivers to take so long to get used to the car? Says G Bench. No, it's not, and I think I may have explained this or touched on my theory on this last week. First of all, hardly any testing. So the cars are different in the way they produce downforce. They've lost a huge chunk of rear end downforce off the back of these reg changes, or a chunk. Maybe it's not a huge chunk anymore. Only 1.5 days if you had a good reliable car in pre-season testing. That's less than we've ever had in the history of the sport before. And also simulators are at a premium. The team simulator, which is the one that is the most effective for learning anything about your actual car, are all based at the team's factories, most of which are in the UK. If you don't live in the UK, which most Formula One drivers don't, you would have to come and quarantine for a week or 10 days, whatever it is at the moment, before you could then go to work in the simulator. There's no time to do that. In previous seasons, you can pop in and out for a morning even, fly in, do a morning on the sim, fly back out again. You can't do that this year. So it is taking a lot longer. We've got less practice sessions at every Grand Prix, less time. They've been shrunk down, haven't they, to an hour from an hour and a half. So the whole seat time has been massively reduced, and that, I'm sure, is having a huge impact on why drivers that have moved teams are taking a lot longer to get up to speed. Letting out the secrets, Mark. It's not a secret. It's well known that Mazepin did a private test schedule going around the world for a year or so. Who was the best of the brilliant drivers McLaren had during your time there? Hakkinen, Coulthard, Raikkonen, Montoya, Alonso or Hamilton, says Elliot Crossan. Good question. Really difficult one again, and I hate to sit on the fence. It's impossible to compare drivers of different eras, and I would say that the Hakkinen-Coulthard era, when I first started at the team, was a completely different era to the Alonso-Hamilton era towards the other end of my time, my 10 years at the team. So they're difficult to compare to each other. What I would say with working with them all, which I was very lucky to do, I would say Kimi Raikkonen in his peak around the mid-2000s was probably the fastest driver that I've ever worked with. He was not a complete Formula One driver because he didn't put enough attention into the finer elements like testing, like data analysis, like all the periphery work that goes in. Put him in a car though, and give him a good car, he would deliver a lap like no one else I've worked with. Sometimes a lap that the car didn't really deserve, he could drag that out. So loved that about Kimi. The most complete driver I have to say that I ever worked with is Lewis Hamilton, because he was not only obviously very talented in the car, but he worked so hard out of the car in terms of working with the team, in terms of studying data, looking for opportunities, his training regime, his diet. He left no stone unturned to be the best that he could, and obviously that has now reaped all sorts of rewards. I would say Mika was a very, very analytical driver. Again, data. He was all about that data. He was all about going out. He didn't want to sit in the garage. You know, even when the team were trying to make changes, he just wanted to get back out there because he knew. It's a little bit like when you get on your game, your PlayStation or whatever. I mean, I'm the same. I just want to get back out and do more laps because I know I can shave another couple of hundredths off a lap time. And he was a bit like that. Very self-analytical about where he could improve in tiny little areas. And I'd say, you know, David Coulthard was one of the best, and my podcast recently talked about this on teamwork. He was one of the best at firing up the team, at getting the team behind him, but perhaps not the most outright talented driver in the world. But he made up for that in a lot of ways with, you know, he was one of the nicest guys I ever worked with. So the team was so behind DC. If DC had ever won a championship with McLaren, I think he'd have been one of the most popular champions that we'd have ever had. And that tells you a lot about how he worked with his team, that everybody just wanted him to win. And he never quite managed to do it because he was up against Mika in the first part of his time there. And then he was up against Kimi, two incredibly quick finished drivers. And he was always the bridesmaid and never the bride, unfortunately. Good question, though. Let me see. What sort of setup changes are made at Portimao compared to flatter tracks? Darren Hayes. So one of the things you do at Portimao, and if you're talking about the sort of undulation as opposed to a much flatter circuit, there's not a huge amount in terms of the undulation because most of those curves, although they are like a roller coaster on TV, none of them are quite like a roller coaster where the car's ever in danger of taking off. But there are a couple of corners, I forget the numbers now. Is it turn 8 where you come over the crest and you're turning right as you go down the other side? The car obviously does go light, just like your road car does when it goes over a crest in the road. Gets to the top of that bump, the car goes light. But it's relative speaking, because of course the downforce on the car is still pushing it down. But in relative terms, you lose essentially a whole bunch of downforce because the car's on the way up. And although it's being pushed down by aerodynamics, with the momentum of the car going up, the 4 contact patches go light and you get essentially less downforce. So you can contradict or contravene some of those effects with your suspension setup. Not so much about the car rising up because it will do that. That's just physics. But of course, if it goes up like that, if the car goes light, it has to come down. And as I said earlier on, keeping as level an aero platform as you can is what really gets the lap time out of any Formula One car. So your suspension setup in terms of things like bump with the dampers and the springs, controlling ride height is important there more so than others, because what you can't have is the car lifting off the ground in those areas or bouncing and bottoming out as it comes back down over the top of that crest or through one of the depths of those roller coaster plunges in the circuit. You need to have things like bump stop control on little sort of squidgy, I've forgotten the word now, bump stops in the bottom of your dampers that will control in the right way how the car settles down at its lowest point. Again, making sure the car can't bottom out too heavily on the ground. So those things you definitely have to pay a bit more attention to, because the car moving up and down on its own platform totally changes the aerodynamic platform of the car and therefore your downforce. And like we talked about with the Williams Peaky Downforce, if the car's constantly riding up and down with a bigger and smaller gap underneath the floor, that massively changes how your downforce works. Particularly on those kind of circuits, that kind of thing is affected or has more of an effect on the high rate cars because they are so dependent on the front wing acting in ground effect. Because the back of the car's up on a Red Bull, let's say, consequently the front of the car is down because that's head of the front axle. The front wing is much closer to the ground. Very deliberately, they can get more front aero because that wing is acting in ground effect, which means it's running so close to the ground, it speeds the airflow up underneath it. It lowers the pressure underneath that front wing more so than on another car that has a much bigger gap, doesn't have the same impact. When there's lower pressure under the front wing, the ambient or higher pressure above it wants to pull its way down to the low pressure zone, and that's how we create downforce and pull the car down onto the racetrack. But that relies on that front wing maintaining a constant gap to the racetrack itself, or as much as you can. You can't keep it completely constant. because it has to move around as the car bounces over curbs and things under braking. But around a circuit like Portimao, where the circuit's always doing this, of course you have to have much more attention to your ride height control elements of your suspension to try and maintain that level platform. I hope that's made some sense. Did you get any rebate on last week's hotel internet service? No, but I definitely should have done. Red Bull seemed to have too much downforce in Portimao. Yes, I think probably their setup favoured a higher downforce, which helped them in certain parts, but certainly when it came to race day, it wasn't so good. Don't forget to talk about Lando. I have, Jamie T. Lando, an incredible job, full of confidence, really, really strong right now. He has got the world at his feet, that kid. What do you think of the Z floor? It seems to be that, I mean, I can't really have an opinion other than they all seem to be moving that way, or lots of them do, and therefore it's clearly showing results in the wind tunnel. I can understand the theory behind it. It does make sense. But it's an evolving area of the car, like I said, but there's more than one team that are now favouring that type of solution. So it looks like that might be where a few of them will converge. Beer o'clock in a few minutes. I know, thank you. Actually, it's wine o'clock tonight. I've got it with me. Who will Barcelona suit? I think it's going to be really close. As I said at the very top of the show, because we've got very hard tyres again in Barcelona, although it's a different surface, you know, it's much more abrasive surface than we got in Portimao, I still feel like it might swing just towards Mercedes, but so close it's really difficult to call, so I'm not really sure. Predictions for Spain. I haven't yet done my seed stream predictions for this week, but I'm going to do it straight after this. If you haven't done yours yet, don't forget, get on there. I'm going to probably go with Lewis Hamilton for the win. Probably Max Verstappen second, but they are close and it's a very difficult one to pick. Behind that, I think Valtteri, I think, is going to be losing confidence the more these run of results go on. You know, Saturday was a great day for Valtteri, but to then lose, you know, to start the race in pole but finish third, that's just disappointing from a driver's perspective. So you know, his confidence is going to start to get battered as the season goes on if this continues. Danny Rick, poor quality but much better race. Yeah, Danny Rick needs to get his head around that car somehow, but I've no doubt he will. No podcast for a few weeks. No, well, as I said, I've come to the end of season 1, so we are having a break with the podcast right now. I'm actually recording some episodes at the moment with other people. I need to get a few of those in the bank, and it'll be a few weeks before we come back with season 2, but don't worry, it's not gone anywhere and it will be back. Will White says, tell us your choice for your prediction so I can go different. That's probably a very good strategy. Right, 2 minutes. What else have we got? Track limits at Spain. Oh, it will be a talking point, won't it? Let's just try and get consistency with that, please. Max for the win for sure in Spain. I mean, it could well be. Could well be. Do you know what I think is going to be really interesting is the psychology between these two. You know, we saw Lewis kind of fight back aggressively against Max. Max did it, of course, in Imola, didn't he? Rubbed wheels at the start of the race. That's what I love. Two racing drivers that are willing to go for it, that both seem to be respectful of each other. And if that continues, we've got a great season ahead. When's Wheeler Dealers on TV? The new series that we are in the midst of filming now that's taken up all of my time. The new series will be new episodes coming on your TV in the UK in the autumn of this year. So that's when you'll start to see it back again. I will, of course, let you know when I have an official date, but that's going very well. Any plans for a new book? Plans, but they are way down the back of the list at the moment. There will be another book, I'm almost certain of that, but just not for some time. Guys, I think that's about it. What team do I root for? McLaren, of course. But of course, I'm also non-biased in my current role. Right, it's 10 o'clock, folks. I need to say a huge thank you to you all. Thanks very much for coming back again. Really, really appreciate it. Feel free to keep the questions coming in on Twitter or Instagram or on YouTube. Use hashtag #AskElvis because that is, as I said, how I always search for any of the questions. So if you put that in there, I will find it and I will respond. I read every single one and I try and respond to every single one as well. So keep the questions coming. Have a great week. Enjoy the Spanish Grand Prix. And don't forget to get that Seed Stream app and get your predictions in. See you later, folks. Ta-da!